Throughout history, the greatest leaders and strategists understood one fundamental truth: life itself is warfare. Beneath the veneer of civilized society, we are all engaged in countless subtle battles for power, influence, and survival. If you find the ideas in this video valuable, you can purchase Robert Greene's complete book, The 33 Strategies of War, through the link in our description below. The 33 Strategies of War isn't just another book about military tactics. It's a profound guide to navigating the complex battlefield of everyday life, from office politics to personal relationships, from business competition to internal psychological struggles. Greene draws from 3,000 years of warfare history to reveal timeless principles that transcend the physical battlefield and apply directly to our modern lives. What makes this book so powerful is how it transforms ancient wisdom into practical strategies you can apply immediately. Whether you're dealing with aggressive competitors, manipulative colleagues, or your own self-defeating tendencies, these battle-tested principles provide a framework for strategic thinking that can transform your approach to life's challenges. Self-directed warfare forms the foundation of Greene's strategic philosophy. Before you can effectively engage with external opponents, you must first conquer the enemies within. These internal adversaries include emotional reactions, biases, and mental patterns that cloud judgment and lead to poor decisions. One of the most dangerous internal enemies is what Greene calls uncontrolled emotional responses. When we react emotionally rather than strategically, we surrender control of the situation to our opponents. Consider how often an argument escalates because someone responds in anger rather than stepping back to assess the situation objectively. By learning to recognize and manage these emotional triggers, you create space for strategic thinking. Another crucial aspect of self-directed warfare is developing what Greene calls the fighting stance, a mindset where you're constantly prepared for conflict while maintaining mental flexibility. This isn't about being paranoid or hostile, but rather about cultivating realistic awareness that conflict is an inevitable part of human interaction. By accepting this reality, you can approach situations with greater clarity and purpose. Take the example of Benjamin Franklin, who transformed himself from an impulsive, argumentative young man into one of history's greatest diplomats. Franklin realized that his quick temper and need to prove himself right were actually undermining his goals. By consciously adopting a more strategic approach to communication, asking questions instead of making assertions, acknowledging others' perspectives before offering his own, he gained far more influence than direct confrontation ever provided. Greene emphasizes that true strategic thinking begins with total clarity about your objectives. Many people fail because they pursue vague goals or allow themselves to be distracted by minor victories. The master strategist remains laser-focused on the ultimate objective while maintaining flexibility about the path to achieve it. This principle appears throughout military history. Genghis Khan's stunning conquests weren't just the result of superior force, but of absolute clarity about his objectives. While his opponents often fought for limited goals like defending a particular territory or protecting specific resources, Khan maintained unwavering focus on his ultimate aim: the complete subjugation of his enemies and the expansion of his empire. This clarity allowed him to make tactical sacrifices when necessary, always with the greater strategic goal in mind. In your own life, this principle means defining exactly what victory looks like before engaging in any conflict. Without this clarity, you risk expending energy on battles that don't advance your true objectives. Ask yourself, what am I really trying to achieve here? What does winning actually mean in this situation? This simple practice can prevent countless wasted efforts. Organizational warfare represents the next dimension of strategic thinking. Even with perfect self-control and clear objectives, you cannot succeed without properly organizing your resources and understanding the terrain on which you're operating. Greene highlights the importance of economy of force, the principle of achieving maximum impact with minimum expenditure of resources. This doesn't just apply to military commanders, but to anyone working with limited time, energy, or capital. Consider how often people burn themselves out by attacking too many problems simultaneously instead of concentrating their efforts where they'll have the greatest effect. Napoleon Bonaparte mastered this principle by identifying the decisive point in any conflict, the position or moment where applying force would yield disproportionate results. Rather than dispersing his armies across multiple fronts, he would concentrate overwhelming force at the critical juncture, often achieving victory against numerically superior opponents. In your daily life, this might mean identifying the key leverage points that will advance your goals most efficiently, rather than exhausting yourself with scattered efforts. Understanding the terrain of your conflicts is equally vital. In military terms, terrain refers to the physical landscape where battles occur, but the concept extends to any environment where strategic engagement takes place. In business, terrain includes market conditions, regulatory frameworks, and competitive landscapes. In personal relationships, it encompasses social dynamics, personalities, and emotional undercurrents. Franklin D. Roosevelt demonstrated masterful understanding of political terrain during the Great Depression. He recognized that the economic crisis had fundamentally altered the American social landscape, creating new possibilities for progressive legislation that would have been impossible in previous eras. By accurately reading this changed terrain, he implemented transformative policies that reshaped American society. Defensive warfare forms a critical component of Greene's strategic framework. While offense often receives more attention, the ability to protect yourself from attacks, whether physical, professional, or psychological, is equally important for long-term success. One key defensive principle is what Greene calls fortifying your center. This means identifying your core vulnerabilities and strengthening them before enemies can exploit them. In personal terms, this might involve acknowledging your psychological blind spots or addressing weaknesses in your professional skill set before they become liabilities. Queen Elizabeth I of England exemplified this principle during her 45-year reign. Surrounded by hostile Catholic powers and facing internal religious divisions, she recognized that England's greatest vulnerability was its naval weakness. By systematically building up the Royal Navy long before the Spanish Armada attacked, she transformed a critical vulnerability into England's greatest strength, setting the foundation for centuries of British naval dominance. Another defensive strategy Greene emphasizes is giving your opponents enough rope to hang themselves. Rather than directly confronting aggressive opponents, sometimes the wisest approach is to allow them to overextend and exhaust themselves. This requires tremendous patience and self-control, but can result in opponents defeating themselves through their own excesses. The Russian defense against Napoleon's invasion in 1812 perfectly illustrates this strategy. Rather than engaging Napoleon's grand army in decisive battle, Russian forces conducted a strategic retreat, drawing the French deeper into Russian territory as winter approached. By allowing Napoleon to overextend his supply lines and exposing his troops to the harsh Russian winter, the Russians effectively let Napoleon defeat himself. The once mighty Grand Army disintegrated without the Russians having to win a single major engagement. In personal or professional conflicts, this principle suggests that sometimes non-engagement is the most powerful response. When provoked by colleagues or competitors, resisting the urge to immediately retaliate can reveal your opponent's true intentions and often leads them to undermine themselves through increasingly desperate actions. Offensive warfare constitutes perhaps the most dynamic aspect of Greene's strategic framework. While defense preserves what you have, offense is necessary to achieve new objectives and transform your position. One offensive principle Greene emphasizes is controlling the dynamic. In any conflict, Certain factors determine the pace and direction of engagement. By identifying and controlling these factors, you can force opponents to react to your initiatives rather than acting according to their own plans. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul demonstrates this principle in action. Rather than allowing the various Gallic tribes to choose when and where to fight, Caesar consistently seized the initiative, attacking at unexpected times and places. This forced his opponents into reactive positions, preventing them from forming unified resistance and allowing Caesar to defeat them piecemeal. In modern contexts, controlling the dynamic might mean setting the agenda in negotiations, establishing the criteria by which success is measured in a project, or defining the terms of debate in a disagreement. Those who control these frameworks often determine outcomes before the actual engagement begins. Another key offensive strategy is what Greene calls the center of gravity attack. This involves identifying the single point that holds an opponent's position together and directing your main effort against it. This could be a key assumption in someone's argument, a critical resource in a competitor's business model, or an essential alliance in a political structure. Alexander the Great employed this strategy against the Persian Empire by recognizing that despite its vast size and resources, the empire's center of gravity was Emperor Darius himself. By focusing his attacks directly on Darius's position during battles, Alexander created disproportionate psychological impact. When Darius fled the battlefield at Gaugamela, the Persian army, though still numerically superior, quickly collapsed, demonstrating how attacking the center of gravity can achieve victory with minimal resources. Unconventional warfare represents the dimension of strategy that transcends established rules and expectations. When conventional approaches fail, or when you face overwhelming opposition, unconventional tactics can create asymmetric advantages. One unconventional strategy Greene highlights is creating a threatening presence. This involves cultivating an aura of unpredictability and potential danger that makes opponents hesitant to challenge you. Unlike direct threats, which often provoke resistance, a threatening presence works through suggestion and uncertainty, leaving others unsure about your capabilities and intentions. Mao Zedong masterfully employed this strategy during China's Civil War. Despite commanding forces that were initially far weaker than the nationalist army, Mao created the impression that his guerrillas were everywhere, could strike anywhere, and enjoyed widespread popular support. This threatening presence had powerful psychological effects, demoralizing nationalist troops and making them reluctant to patrol areas where communist forces might be present, effectively ceding control of vast territories without direct confrontation. In personal or professional contexts, creating a threatening presence might involve strategic ambiguity about your resources, capabilities, or intentions. By keeping competitors guessing about your next move, you can often deter challenges without direct confrontation. Another unconventional approach is what Greene calls the paradoxical strategy. This involves deliberately doing what opponents least expect, often the opposite of conventional wisdom. When everyone else is advancing, you retreat. When they retreat, you advance. When they expect aggression, you offer cooperation. The Byzantine Empire employed paradoxical strategies to survive for nearly 1,000 years despite being surrounded by more powerful enemies. Rather than engaging in direct military confrontation with superior forces, Byzantine emperors often used diplomacy, bribery, and strategic marriages to turn potential attackers against each other. When military action was necessary, they frequently avoided pitched battles in favor of ambushes, naval operations, or psychological warfare, always choosing the approach enemies least expected. In modern contexts, paradoxical strategies might involve entering markets that competitors have abandoned, adopting technologies others have rejected, or responding to aggression with unexpected collaboration. The key is breaking predictable patterns that opponents can easily counter. Competitive warfare focuses on situations where you face direct rivals pursuing similar objectives. Unlike conventional warfare with clear enemies, competitive warfare often involves multiple parties maneuvering within established rules and frameworks. One competitive strategy Greene emphasizes is controlling the options. This involves structuring situations so that all available choices seem to favor your position. Rather than forcing others to take a specific action, you create circumstances where any reasonable decision they make ultimately serves your interests. The ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu described this approach as the highest form of generalship, noting that supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. By controlling the strategic context rather than focusing on tactical victories, you can often achieve objectives with minimal resistance. Otto von Bismarck demonstrated this principle during German unification in the 19th century. Rather than directly challenging other European powers, he carefully maneuvered France, Austria, and Russia into positions where they couldn't effectively oppose Prussian ambitions without threatening their own interests. Each diplomatic crisis he engineered was structured so that other powers had to choose between unpalatable options, gradually allowing Prussia to achieve dominance without provoking a unified opposition. In business or personal negotiations, controlling options might involve framing proposals so that all available choices support your underlying objectives, even when specific terms appear to be compromises. This requires understanding others' priorities and constraints deeply enough to structure situations that naturally channel their decisions toward your preferred outcomes. Another competitive strategy is forcing the enemy onto the horns of a dilemma. This involves creating situations where opponents must choose between two equally unattractive options. Unlike controlling options, which can be subtle, this approach deliberately creates visible discomfort for opponents, often exposing contradictions in their position. Hannibal used this strategy against the Romans when he invaded Italy. By positioning his army between Rome and its allies, he forced Roman generals to choose between defending the capital and protecting their alliances. Either choice involved significant political and military costs, creating paralysis in Roman decision-making that Hannibal exploited for years. In modern contexts, forcing dilemmas might involve exposing inconsistencies in a competitor's market positioning, highlighting contradictions between someone's stated principles and their actions, or creating scenarios where maintaining one valued relationship requires sacrificing another. The key is identifying genuine contradictions within opponents' priorities rather than simply presenting difficult choices. Psychological warfare addresses the mental and emotional dimensions of conflict. While physical resources matter, Greene emphasizes that battles are ultimately won or lost in the minds of participants. One psychological strategy is undermining enemy morale. This involves targeting opponents' confidence and will to resist rather than their material capabilities. Even well-equipped and numerically superior forces can be defeated if they lose the psychological will to continue fighting. Genghis Khan excelled at psychological warfare, often sending agents ahead of his armies to spread terrifying stories about Mongol brutality. These stories served two purposes. They demoralized defenders before battles began and encouraged quick surrenders to avoid the promised destruction. Importantly, selective acts of extreme violence against cities that resisted reinforced these threats, creating a cycle where mere rumors of the Mongols' approach often prompted immediate capitulation. In contemporary settings, undermining morale might involve highlighting competitors' failures, drawing attention to internal contradictions in opposing organizations, or creating the impression that resistance is futile. While ethical boundaries must be respected, understanding how confidence affects performance remains critically important in any competitive environment. Another psychological strategy is manipulating perception. This involves shaping how others interpret events and information rather than changing the underlying realities. Since people respond to their perceptions rather than to objective conditions, controlling these perceptions often determines outcomes more effectively than changing material circumstances. Elizabeth I mastered perception manipulation during her reign. Despite England's relatively weak position compared to Spain and France, she cultivated an image of majesty and power through elaborate court ceremonies, strategic public appearances, and carefully managed artistic representations. These efforts convinced both foreign powers and domestic subjects that England was stronger than its objective resources suggested, deterring potential challengers and building national confidence. In modern contexts, perception management might involve controlling the narrative around organizational changes, framing competitive setbacks as strategic pivots, or highlighting aspects of your performance that align with currently valued metrics. The key is recognizing that objective reality matters less than how that reality is interpreted and understood. Alliance warfare focuses on the strategic use of relationships with other parties. Even the strongest individual actors rarely succeed alone, making the ability to form, maintain, and leverage alliances essential for sustained success. One alliance strategy Greene highlights is cultivating strategic partnerships. This involves identifying and developing relationships with others whose interests align with yours in meaningful ways. Unlike transactional relationships based solely on immediate exchange, strategic partnerships involve deeper alignment around core objectives. The alliance system Bismarck constructed in 19th century Europe exemplifies this approach. Rather than seeking alliances based on ideological similarity or historical ties, Bismarck pragmatically identified partners whose concrete interests aligned with Prussian objectives at specific moments. By focusing on material interests rather than sentiment or principle, he created a flexible alliance system that protected German security while isolating potential threats. In business or personal contexts, cultivating strategic partnerships might involve identifying relationships that create mutual advantage through complementary strengths rather than similar capabilities. The most valuable partners often possess resources or abilities that you lack rather than simply reinforcing your existing strengths. Another alliance strategy is dividing and conquering. This involves preventing potential opponents from uniting against you by exploiting existing tensions between them or creating new sources of conflict that make cooperation difficult. The British Empire employed this strategy extensively throughout its colonial period. In India, for example, British administrators carefully maintained and sometimes exacerbated religious, ethnic, and caste divisions among the population, making unified resistance to colonial rule nearly impossible. By positioning themselves as neutral arbiters between competing local factions, British authorities maintained control with relatively limited military resources. In organizational contexts, dividing and conquering might involve highlighting how different departments' interests diverge when facing potential changes, emphasizing how competing priorities create legitimate tensions between teams, or structuring initiatives so that natural organizational rivalries prevent unified opposition. While manipulative applications raise ethical concerns, understanding how group dynamics affect collective action remains essential for strategic success. Deception warfare explores how controlling information flows can create strategic advantages. Since all decisions depend on available information, shaping what others know or think they know often determines outcomes more effectively than direct confrontation. One deception strategy Greene emphasizes is creating false impressions. This involves deliberately projecting images that don't reflect reality to influence opponents' decisions and actions. Unlike simple lies, sophisticated deception creates coherent alternative realities that opponents accept as truth. The Allied deception operations preceding the D-Day invasion represent perhaps history's most elaborate example of creating false impressions. Operation Fortitude involved thousands of personnel, hundreds of fake military installations, and elaborate double-agent networks all designed to convince German intelligence that the main Allied landing would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. This comprehensive deception succeeded so completely that even after the Normandy landings began, Hitler withheld critical reserves, believing the real attack was still to come elsewhere. In contemporary settings, creating false impressions might involve deliberately advertising initiatives that draw competitors' attention away from your actual priorities, cultivating public personas that mask your true intentions, or establishing decoy projects that absorb competitors' counter-efforts while your main initiatives proceed unimpeded. Another deception strategy is masking your intentions. Rather than creating elaborate false realities, this approach focuses on preventing others from discerning your true objectives until it's too late for effective opposition. Thomas Cromwell, chief minister to Henry VII, mastered the art of masking intentions. While methodically dismantling the Catholic Church's power in England and transferring its wealth to the crown, Cromwell publicly maintained that these were merely administrative reforms aimed at curbing specific abuses. By the time the cumulative effect of his seemingly disconnected policy changes became clear, the transformation was already irreversible. In business contexts, masking intentions might involve framing disruptive innovations as minor product improvements, describing major strategic pivots as tactical adjustments, or presenting revolutionary changes as evolutionary developments. The key is allowing each individual step to appear innocuous, while the complete pattern remains visible only to you. Timing warfare addresses the crucial role of when actions occur. Greene emphasizes that identical actions often produce drastically different results depending on their timing, making temporal awareness essential for strategic success. One timing strategy is seizing the critical moment. This involves identifying periods when temporary conditions create unusual opportunities and acting decisively during these windows. Unlike impulsive opportunism, this approach requires both prepared capabilities and the discernment to recognize genuine opportunities. Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon exemplifies perfect timing. By returning to Italy precisely when political divisions in Rome were at their height, Caesar exploited a temporary vulnerability that might not have existed months earlier or later. His famous declaration, "The die is cast," acknowledged that this critical moment required immediate, decisive action despite its risks. In modern contexts, seizing critical moments might involve launching products during competitors' periods of organizational transition, introducing organizational changes during times of external crisis, when resistance is naturally reduced, or addressing interpersonal conflicts during rare moments when all parties recognize the unsustainability of current patterns. Another timing strategy is playing the long game. This involves deliberately delaying gratification and immediate advantage to secure greater benefits in the future. Unlike simple patience, the long game requires actively building positions that will yield advantages at specifically anticipated future moments. Singapore's founding father Lee Kuan Yew exemplified long-game thinking in national development. Rather than pursuing policies that would deliver immediate economic benefits or political popularity, Lee consistently prioritized investments in education, infrastructure, and institutional integrity that would position Singapore advantageously decades later. By accepting short-term sacrifices for long-term positioning, he transformed a resource-poor island into one of the world's most prosperous nations. In personal or organizational contexts, playing the long game might involve declining immediately attractive opportunities that would limit future flexibility, investing in capabilities that won't yield returns for years, or cultivating relationships without immediate benefit because they align with anticipated future needs. The key is maintaining clear vision of future conditions while resisting the pull of immediate rewards. Integration warfare represents the highest level of strategic thinking in Greene's framework. While other dimensions focus on specific aspects of conflict, integration involves synthesizing multiple approaches into coherent, adaptable systems. One integration strategy is orchestrating multiple forces. This involves coordinating different types of pressure that reinforce each other rather than relying on single approaches. Unlike simple combined tactics, orchestration creates synergies where each element magnifies the effectiveness of others. Alexander the Great mastered this approach in his campaigns. Rather than relying solely on military force, Alexander simultaneously deployed economic incentives, cultural integration policies, psychological operations, and political restructuring in conquered territories. These integrated efforts reinforced each other, making resistance seem not only militarily hopeless but economically disadvantageous and culturally unnecessary. In business contexts, orchestrating multiple forces might involve simultaneously addressing market positioning, organizational culture, technological capabilities, and leadership development rather than treating these as separate initiatives. The key is recognizing how advances in one domain create opportunities in others, generating momentum that isolated efforts cannot achieve. Another integration strategy is adapting to changing conditions. This involves maintaining strategic coherence while tactically adjusting to evolving circumstances. Unlike mere reactivity, strategic adaptation preserves core objectives while flexibly responding to new information and altered environments. Queen Elizabeth I demonstrated remarkable adaptive capability throughout her reign. While maintaining consistent objectives regarding English sovereignty and religious settlement, she adjusted her tactics repeatedly as conditions changed, sometimes presenting herself as a militant Protestant champion, other times as a moderate willing to accommodate diverse practices. This tactical flexibility within strategic consistency allowed her to navigate threats that would have overwhelmed more rigid rulers. In contemporary settings, adapting to changing conditions might involve maintaining consistent organizational values while evolving business models, preserving core relationship commitments while adjusting communication patterns, or pursuing consistent personal development goals through varying methods as circumstances change. The key is distinguishing between fundamental objectives that should remain stable and tactical approaches that must evolve. The inner war addresses perhaps the most fundamental battlefield, the struggle within ourselves. Greene emphasizes that external conflicts often reflect internal divisions, making self-mastery the foundation for all other strategic success. One inner strategy is conquering negative emotions. This involves recognizing how fear, anger, pride, and other destructive emotions distort perception and decision-making. Unlike suppressing emotions, conquering them means understanding their origins and transforming their energy into constructive forms. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius exemplified this approach. Despite facing constant wars, political intrigues, personal tragedies, and eventually terminal illness, he maintained remarkable strategic clarity by systematically examining his emotional responses and tracing them to their underlying judgments and assumptions. By questioning these foundations rather than being driven by the emotions themselves, he made decisions based on principle rather than reaction. In modern contexts, conquering negative emotions might involve recognizing when competitive anxiety drives unnecessary aggression, identifying how fear of failure creates excessive caution, or understanding how desires for validation lead to strategic overextension. The key is developing self-awareness deep enough to distinguish between emotional impulses and genuine strategic imperatives. Another inner strategy is cultivating strategic empathy. This involves developing genuine understanding of others' perspectives, motivations, and constraints, not merely as manipulation, but as foundation for effective engagement. Unlike superficial analysis of others' behavior, strategic empathy creates deep insight into why people act as they do. Abraham Lincoln demonstrated extraordinary strategic empathy during the Civil War. Despite the existential conflict, he maintained nuanced understanding of Southern perspectives, including both elite interests and ordinary citizens' concerns. This empathy informed his approach to Reconstruction planning, and likely would have produced more sustainable reconciliation had he lived to implement it. In personal or professional contexts, cultivating strategic empathy might involve genuinely trying to understand colleagues' resistance to organizational changes, exploring competitors' strategic constraints rather than dismissing their choices as errors, or examining how personal relationships break down through mutual misunderstanding rather than assigning simple blame. The key is recognizing that understanding others' reality, even when you disagree with their conclusions, provides strategic advantages unavailable through judgment alone. Throughout the 33 Strategies of War, Greene emphasizes that strategic thinking isn't just about defeating others, but about achieving objectives with maximum efficiency and minimum destruction. The master strategist wins without fighting whenever possible, conserves resources for truly necessary battles, and transforms opponents into allies when interests align. By internalizing these timeless principles drawn from history's greatest strategists, you develop not just tactical advantage but a fundamentally different relationship with conflict itself. Rather than being driven by reaction, insecurity, or impulse, you approach life's inevitable battles with clarity, purpose, and perspective. The ultimate victory isn't dominating others but achieving your true objectives while maintaining internal coherence and external connections. As Sun Tzu wrote over 2 millennia ago, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The greatest strategists understand that genuine victory creates not just immediate advantage but sustainable success, and ultimately, a world where destructive conflict becomes increasingly unnecessary. If you found value in these insights from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth book summaries. Your engagement helps us continue creating high-quality content that distills wisdom from the world's most transformative books. Also, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which strategy resonated most with you? How might you apply these principles in your personal or professional life? We'd love to hear about your experiences with strategic thinking.